Welcome to the Cliveden Literary Festival 2023. I'm delighted to kick it off with this fabulous panel. Enjoy, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much. And thanks for coming to the Cliveden Literary Festival. We're going to kick off this morning with a slightly serious subject, which is the economy. And we have an amazing panel of really seriously successful business people who are going to try and have a conversation really about what Britain might do next. We have Emma Walmsley in the gorgeous yellow shirt, who is CEO of GlaxoSmithKline and also on the board of Microsoft. So she spans this extraordinarily exciting sector from life sciences to tech. In the middle, we have Ian Livingstone, very, very successful entrepreneur and investor with many years behind him of building successful companies. And to my left, we have Octavius Black, the founder of Mind Gym, again, an extraordinarily successful global business, which has really transformed, I think, the way that people think about how to do work. So I guess we're meeting here today. The Conservatives are about to go to their party conference in Manchester. We're all hearing a lot of news about big infrastructure projects. Will they be cancelled? Will they go ahead? The IFS has just said, that Britain, the Parliament, we now have the sort of biggest tax take we've had at any time. And I guess, maybe things are looking a bit bleak. I wrote a column in the Financial Times a few months ago which was called Britain Needs to Get Out of Its Doom Loop. And the response to that column was absolutely huge. A lot of people saying, yeah, we really do need to get out of this doom loop. What has happened to our country? We've lost our mojo. So I think, I think we should try and have in this room an optimistic conversation about what we might do differently, and if we are in a big hole, how we can get out of it. So, Emma, I'd like to start with you, and I'm going to ask all three panellists the same question at the beginning, which is really how can the UK improve its economic growth and improve its productivity?
Great. Well, good morning to everybody. And first of all, I am not an economist, but I am an optimist and I am a globalist. And I think fundamentally we can all be very optimistic about the prospects for growth for our country, especially if we and the government focus on two priority things. The first one is to incent investment, and especially investment in innovation in sectors where we know what we're doing, and investment both from within the country, but very importantly from outside the country as well, to support and accelerate growth over the long term. And then secondly, and that's really where I'd like to spend some time commenting, exactly as you said, Camilla, to address this long-term structural challenge that we have of productivity in the UK, and especially within that, the direct link between our nation's health, the health of society, and our productivity, because healthier people contribute more, they cost less, and frankly, they're happier too. I'm not sure what the government's responsibility is for that, but it really would help. And the issue is, in this country, we have two big challenges. We have a declining participation in the workforce. I think you were saying that this morning, 3 million less people working. Some of that is contracting out, but particularly in this case, it's long-term disability and poor health. But we also have a very important demographic time bomb going on. This is a country, like many of the Western countries in the world, that is structurally aging. Lifespans are going up, not necessarily quality lifespans, but they are going up, especially for women. But we are generally aging unhealthily. And that is a really big issue in terms of demographics. But by 2035, 2 in 3 of the over 65, so let's say Camilla is going to be completely fine, because, by the way, she is a professor, as well as writing for the FT, she is a professor of demographics and has written a brilliant book, since we're at a literary festival. No, but I don't think it's on sale here, but you should definitely buy it. It's called Extra Time, and it is all about this question of getting to tells the government exactly what they should do, but also what we should do as individuals, getting to how we should increase our health span, not just our lifespan. And by 2035...
I didn't ask.
No, she didn't. But, we are starting off a literary festival with an economics discussion. So I think, as at least, one book in the room. And it will make you pause for thought personally. But 2 in 3 of the over 65s, so 2 out of the 3 of us by 2035, is going to be living with at least 2 long-term chronic diseases. And 1 in the 3 of us has got either dementia or depression to look forward to. I said I was optimistic. And I want you to think about the long-term cost of caring for that in society, beyond even our individual direct contributions. And the reality is that this is a double-edged sort of impact. The direct impact of GDP, of non-participation in the workforce, is massive. I think the Blair Institute said that if we reduce those sick days by 10 to 20%, you could add 60 billion back to GDP, 3% or so. But also the burden on the NHS is absolutely unsustainable, and we can see that now. And so the solution, I think, or one big proposal I would be saying is, let's pivot to investing in prevention of disease. Let's harness new technologies, the sectors where we know what we're doing, a single universal healthcare system to be more predictive, to get to the root causes in partnership with the food industry of obesity, which has so many knock-on effects to our general health. Let's address the mental health pandemic. Let's start to prevent disease with adult vaccination. I mean, the ROI on vaccinating people and keeping them out of hospital is up to 300%. And 80% of the world's innovation in vaccines is for adults to prevent disease. So, if only we could make the NHS a system in which we don't spend cost on sickness, but we invest in our wellness and health, then I think we can have a real acceleration of productivity, get people back to work and living, as young old, as you would say, extending our health span and contributing more productively to society. And there is no better country than the UK to address this, because we have a single healthcare platform. We can invest in technology there, and we have a very exciting life sciences industry that can contribute to innovation. If we want to have a healthier economy, we need a healthier society.
Can I just ask you on that, what you're seeing, particularly in terms of vaccines? Do you think we're going to be seeing vaccines against high cholesterol, for example? Are vaccines going to change, really fundamentally transform public health?
I believe that very, very deeply, and we saw through the pandemic, the value of vaccination, but most excitingly, the vaccines aren't just for babies anymore.
Right.
And there is incredible new exciting technology, whether that be mRNA or new platforms in, I could get very technical here, but in MAPS technology, we can prevent you, and people are, starting to think more about how you could intervene in cancer long term. These can be a decade away, right, but we have to, back to the earlier point, invest in innovation. Because, ultimately there are many diseases we still don't have solutions to.
Excellent. Octavius,
yes.
There's a lot to address there.
Well, I'm going to pick up.
What's your solution for improving UK productivity?
I'm going to pick up Emma's wellbeing themes. I think it's incredibly important, and I think there are answers that are relatively clear as to what will make a difference, but the challenge is doing the right things. So if I take the world of work, for example, organisations are investing vast amounts in trying to improve the wellbeing of their employees. But in a recent study over 2 years, they had 3,000 people go through up to 30 different wellbeing initiatives, addiction helplines, physical exercise and competitions, fresh fruit, mindfulness applications, and the control trial was 23,000. And on 78 out of 80 measures, those who went through those programs were no better off than those that had not.
Whoa.
BMI, sleep, anxiety, absenteeism, all the rest of it were unchanged. The only two that changed was one is intent to lose weight, but BMI was the same, so you can argue that.
We can all relate.
We can all relate to that. And the other was a fraction more exercise. So what this tells us is that organisations are spending $50 billion a year, destined to get $100 billion in 5 years on employee well-being, but they're spending it in the wrong way. And the research is really clear what does affect it. There are 5 basic conditions, one of which is certainty. So the more you feel certainty, the more likely you are to improve your well-being, less likely to have experience chronic or acute stress and so on and so forth. Now, organizations can provide this for their employees every day. You know, your boss says to you, I need to see you tomorrow for 5 minutes. You go, crumbs, what's it about? A disaster. Or your boss says, I need to see you tomorrow for 5 minutes. I love that report. I want to know more. Another 12 words. You're relaxed. Easy. That's certainty there. So there's lots in the way that we work, in the organizational culture, that will create that sense of well-being at work. But businesses are determined to focus on trying to affect our life outside of work rather than improving the workplace culture. Exactly. Secondly, I want to come talk about the NHS and the way in which we go about trying to improve healthcare. The airline industry is phenomenal at looking at near misses and treating them as real incidents. And they talk about them to understand exactly what happened, without blame, without recourse, but to explain what it was that happened and therefore what could be done differently. There is now one crash for every 11 million takeoffs. The transformation in improvement is phenomenal. The NHS, I'm afraid to say, is at the other end of this spectrum. 68% of people who whistleblow in some form or other are either dismissed or feel they suffer seriously as a result. There was a case recently in the southwest of England where a medic wrote to the husband of a wife who'd been died in a botched operation, and it was an anonymous letter to the husband explaining what had happened. The healthcare trust employed a forensic scientist to look for fingerprints on the letter to identify the whistleblower, which is like the opposite of what you should be doing to try and change this. So I totally agree there's enormous capacity to improve well-being and healthcare, but at the moment we're not doing the right things to address it.
Can I just ask, that's incredibly interesting, and I used to sit on the board of the hospital regulator. And you do get, the NHS does, I think, is brilliant in some things and in other things is very closed off. I've always believed that most people don't actually want to sue. They want an explanation and they want an apology. Do you think that we've become too legalised and that now lawyers are advising essentially the NHS to say, no, we're not going to interface with you? Because a lot of people, I think, accept accidents happen, mistakes are made, but they want someone to actually talk to. And they're not getting that anymore?
I think, well, I'm not sure they ever did get it. There's very interesting research in the States that your chances of being sued as a doctor, there's one thing that massively affects the probability you will or won't be sued. Yeah. And it's not whether you get the diagnosis right or the patient recovers, which you think would be the thing that would make most difference. Yeah. It's an extra 6 minutes in the initial consultation. Oh, yeah. So if you feel listened to, you're much less likely to sue. But I think
which goes back to your point about workplace culture more generally, doesn't it?
It's all about workplace culture. It's all about the environment that says we want to learn. I was just talking earlier this week with a psychologist called Amy Edmondson, who wrote a book on psychological safety, which is all about the idea that there's a link between being candid and seeking excellence. And we need to be open to being really candid with each other and listening to those ideas and not being offended by it or upset by it, but being willing to respond and build and learn in the pursuit of excellence. And bringing that back into the NHS or into the NHS, and indeed other services and organisations as well, I think is a really strong route to increasing productivity, solving problems, working out how to make improvements, making everything run better.
And maybe my profession, the media, might sort of occasionally remember to stop whacking people all the time. Ian, would you like to address this massive question of UK growth and productivity?
I'm overall quite optimistic that the UK will continue to do well. We're not doing as badly as papers would have you believe. I think confidence maybe is a little low at the moment. One of my big issues, I think, going forward is having a correct education system. And I was pleased to see that the government is actually looking at A-levels and the narrow focus of A-levels and trying to expand that into things like more maths and more English and financial awareness for people who are in further education. I think we need to get rid of the stigma of people not having been at university. I think that this random 50% number that was originally introduced by Tony Blair that said 50% of people should be in universities, I'm not sure that's correct or appropriate for the world that we're in. I think that we need more technical qualifications, more apprenticeships, more technology, and we should applaud that rather than saying people didn't go to university. Because I think that going forward, humanities degrees are all very well and there's a place for them, but I think we need to be more focused on where we need to be in competitiveness. And I think another area that we should look into more, which we've really failed, is the whole issue of urban regeneration, because we have decaying high streets around the country. We have no particular plan of how to deal with those. Retailers are failing left, right, and centre. And that's the world that we live in. We're not going to reverse that, but I think that we could do much better with the spaces that are vacated in these city centres. We can have more sustainable communities, healthier communities, less people that are socially excluded, and more regeneration through that.
And when you think about that, Ian, are you thinking that we could turn retail spaces into housing, or are you thinking that actually we need to level the playing field between online sellers and high street sellers? Or I mean, what are the things you're thinking about there?
I think that what we need is sustainable communities, and I think that probably means more high quality in-town housing for people that can live and work. I think that it's all very well having delivery services, but having millions of vans and cyclists running around with abandon is probably not the answer. And I think that if you deliver things into urban centres, into small fulfillment centres, to bring people back into high streets, you'll start to recreate communities that we are sadly losing.
This is I always think this is quite an interesting aspect of the net zero conversation, is that all of us who've kind of really tried to start cycling or driving less are also constantly pressing a button on Amazon, which means a van is driving for hundreds of miles to deliver one tiny thing to our house in an enormous package. But anyway, that's all very interesting. And can I come back to you on universities as well? Because I agree with you, there seems to be still too much of a stigma against going into vocational education. Do you think that's partly about parents? Because I wonder whether parents are often thinking, my child has got to get a university degree. Do you think that's part of the problem?
I think that's absolutely part of the problem. And I think that employers have to be aware of it, and employers have to have a much broader mindset in who they accept, and people who are smart. I mean, we see people in our business every day who are university educated and not necessarily smart or appropriate for the roles that we want. And give me a smart person rather than necessarily an educated person.
So what would you say your criteria are when you hire somebody?
When I hire somebody?
When you hire somebody, what's your criteria? What's most important to you?
I think it's a work ethic. I think it's an excitement about the job. I think it's wanting to get on. And I don't think, and some relevant experience, but more importantly, it's that ethic of work and excitement and wanting to be the best in their field. And I don't really judge people on what their academic background is.
Interesting. Fantastic. And by the way, we will open up to questions towards the end, so start thinking of your questions now if you want to. Emma, can I come back to you? You've all been brilliantly optimistic and helpful, which is great. I mean, what sectors do you think are going to drive a recovery? I mean, when I say recovery, I mean, Ian made the point. I mean, clearly, for reasons that I don't completely understand, we've been living with the idea that we were the worst in the G7 for the last 3 years, and it turns out we weren't the worst in the G7, and we got the numbers wrong. So clearly, Britain is not doing quite as badly as we feared. But what industries do you think are going to really drive the next phase of growth in Britain?
Well, first of all, I definitely think we can be optimistic, especially if we take a slightly longer-term view. But we shouldn't be naive, and we should definitely recognise that we have to make some choices and place some bets. And like in any business, I think it's absolutely right that we focus on industries where we have a track record, good capability, the right ecosystem, and sensible and appealing prospects for growth. And there are plenty of them in this country, by the way. They should be industries where we can not only contribute locally from a community point of view, domestically, but also where we can attract foreign direct investment from other countries and global multinationals to help spur that growth and create opportunities. So the obvious ones are, of course, going to be in life sciences, including technology. I say that because we are, as an industry, a top 5 exporter. Yeah. We contribute, I think, 38 billion to the GDP. We employ 750,000 people, and we really feed off both the academic institutions, but also a single health payer system, big multinationals, but also the emerging biotech sector as well. And by the way, I completely agree with Ian that we need really brilliant technical manufacturing apprentices as much as we need the PhDs in the labs. And I think, attitude is just as important, and energy as anything, letters you put after your name. But so life science is a big one. Technology is going to change the productivity of everything. I'm an optimist there. It needs to be sensibly regulated and kept safe, but human beings have always used technology to improve our performance, and it shouldn't go amiss that, in the world, the big trillion-dollar market cap companies invest, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, all invest strongly in the UK because they have great capability here. And then I think, how can you not say the creative industries? Yeah. Whether it's, we're good on Nobel Prizes as a country, we're also good on Oscars, whether it's the films, writers, music, the arts more generally. And all of this is underpinned by a culture we have in this country, which we shouldn't generalize on, but I think we can be proud of and fuel and feed of innovation, creativity, challenge, quite a lot of diversity actually. Still work to do to be more inclusive. And as long as it's underpinned by serious incentives from the government, from a fiscal point of view, from stability, from regulatory capability and investment in skills, I think we have every shot, but we've got to make some choices to win in the areas that we can be really competitive in.
So Octavius, what do you think about that? Where do you see, clearly you've talked about mindset and we need to have the right mindset. Is that universal across sectors, or do you think there are some sectors that the government should be backing or that we should be thinking about as the ones that are going to drive the future?
I totally agree with Emma on the sectors that you've mentioned. I think AI has this ability to transform our lives in very positive ways, and I think Britain has an opportunity to be at the leading edge of that. We have one of the best AI departments in Edinburgh. We have really strong capabilities.
And we're hosting a big conference, the government, in November, a global conference on particularly the safety of innovating in AI, which is a great example of where we can, lead the way.
This is something, can I just ask you, because this is something the Prime Minister was clearly very keen, Britain's trying to position itself as a kind of leader in AI, and I know they've talked to the White House about it. Is that actually realistic? Is Britain able to position itself as leader in AI in that way, to have that global conversation, do you think?
I would have thought we're one of the few.
You have to think about it. We don't have a trillion-dollar market cap cloud provider. No. But the point of this is it's not just the foundations of the tech stack, it's what you lay on top of it.
Right.
And DeepMind, part of Google, was begun here in this country.
But that's that's always been, there's what we call the valley of death, isn't there here? We create these fantastic industries like DeepMind, and then they go to America.
Well, actually, they're still headquartered here, and that guy is leading the whole of AI for Google. I actually think the way we should think about it is how are we putting it into not only every business but every how are we creating a more equality and access to education through technology? That every field, government, the NHS, family productivity, all of these can be impacted by the opportunity here, but we have to regulate it sensibly.
And Israel's been very successful in technology without having a massive GDP. Yeah. So I think, yes, of course, the states are going to be a massive player in this, but there'll be many massive players in it, or many influential players, and we have every chance to be one. And the opportunity is to I was with someone the other day who's building a wedding planning business. And they have to have photographs of every single napkin and marquee and all the different things in order to be able to launch their website. And normally they have to commission models and get the right weather and put the marquee up and all of this sort of stuff, and it takes weeks, and they have to own the IP. They did the whole thing with AI in 2 days to create the 4,000 photographs for their website, and they owned all the IP for it. There's an extraordinary ability to transform. Now, obviously, it has a big effect on people who would otherwise be the photographers, on the models and so forth. So it's going to change the economy quite significantly. But the scale of this shift this is just the beginning of it. It's colossal.
I guess we can't be disintermediated, right? We are all actual human beings having an actual conversation. But certainly in my profession of journalism, lots of journalists have already written columns which they then tell you were written by ChatGPT, which seems to be a slightly self-defeating thing to do. But I mean, there is going to be a massive transformation, isn't there? And back to what you said about certainty, which I think was so powerful. We are living at a time when people feel very uncertain about the global economy, there's a lot of things coming at us, aren't there? And this is another one of those.
Absolutely.
And we kind of have to be careful, I guess, how we
therefore,
present
the key is to build that, some people could use the word resilience, out of that agility, that desire and appetite for learning. And if we teach our next generation or ourselves now high appetite for learning, then we'll find that we're able to cope with whatever comes our way.
And how do you do that? Because we've all talked about lifelong learning and all this stuff. How do you teach an appetite for learning?
Well, by encouraging failure, intelligent failure. By allowing, say, it's great to make mistakes if they're the right kinds of mistakes, ones that you couldn't have just researched on the internet or fixed already, and that we learn from those mistakes. The airline industry versus the NHS, as I talked about earlier, is you're constantly saying, what is the new information I've got? There's a brilliant psychologist called Philip Tetlock who did a super forecasting. We identified the people who are best able to predict the future. And there's a small group that's much better to predict the future, which is no surprise. There's always a small group that's better at something. But what was interesting is what was differential about them. And what differentiated them was they had no worldviews. They didn't think free trade was good or bad, or immigration was good or bad. They were constantly curious, gathering new information. Right. And they were constantly adapting their forecasts with the new information they got. So they were curious, they were learning, they were adapting. Now, interesting enough, they're the last people we listen to about the future. We listen to brilliant columnists who have a worldview, who we can rely on.
Well, and also are, by the way, paid to be polemical.
Exactly.
You have to write a successful column, you have to take one side or the other.
And you can't keep changing your mind.
No, you can't change your mind. Exactly right. And actually, neither can politicians. They're kind of trapped in this. I don't want to change my mind.
Well, this is one of the big shifts, is we can get it so that if you're a businessman like Ian, and you invest in 20 companies and 2 of them do brilliantly and 6 do okay and 12 don't quite work, you're probably like, that's quite a good result. If you're a government and you invest in 20 different forms of school and 19 of them are brilliant and one of them is a disaster, you only get slammed for the one that's a disaster.
Fundamentally, though, one of the major issues here is government has to let the private sector figure out how to grow. Yes, I think you're right, absolutely right about which sectors, and you're right about mindset. But the government has to give the private sector the oxygen to develop, because governments don't create jobs. Governments don't create wealth at the end of the day. And how do we do that? We give people infrastructure, we give them incentives, and that may be education, and it may be taxation breaks, it may be specific areas of expertise. We talk about the arc between Oxford and Cambridge. What are we doing? And I think the government has started to finally get on board with that. Yeah. So the government can provide infrastructure and basics and incentivization, because at the end of the day, people need to be incentivized to take risks. People will make mistakes, but if you don't incentivize the upside by increasing taxes, then people will A, not take risks, or B, invest elsewhere. And so we've got to be cognizant that we're in a globally competitive environment. Yeah, exactly. We need to have a tax system that works, that's appropriate for our public services, but also encourages entrepreneurialism.
So what would you do, Ian, about tax and regulation yourself? I mean, do you think we're overregulated?
It's very easy to say we're overregulated. Yeah. We've come out of the European Union. We still haven't really figured out where we sit in the European free trade zone, whether we're in or out or near it. And I think there's a lot of work still to be done on regulation. Taxation, clearly we need something that incentivizes long-term investment. And I think if you start leveling up capital gains tax and income tax, there's a problem. Right. I'd like to see more enterprise zones where there are specific areas of reduced taxation that encourages growth in certain parts of the country.
Is that the same thing that Michael Heseltine did 20 years ago?
Effectively,
yes. A sort of Docklands type idea?
Yes. And it could be sector related in biotech, it could be geographically related.
I really, really agree with this point on structural incentives. GSK, less than 3%, about 2.5% of our business is in the UK. Yeah. But we invest very heavily here. It's our second biggest country in the world for clinical trials. We spend more than $1 billion here in R&D because of a tax patent-based incentive, where if we innovate here, there are tax breaks for it. And, you know, if the country if we have a regulator who is extremely, who are actually pretty capable in our place, and it was shown through COVID how in our sector, if we kind of shake off the sense of now having a very small domestic market because we're no longer part of Europe and we can't compete, frankly, with the $400 billion the US are investing in incenting through the IRA regulation in all sorts of sectors. We can't compete with that. But so let's not worry about that. Let's focus on where we're good and create specific incentives in the sector where we can do well so that our domestic companies want to invest and other people come here because of our talent pool, our skills, a government that hopefully can bring some stability and some long-term strategic investment. Let's not play to tomorrow's headlines or next quarter's results. And then I think we have a much better shot of building some structural long-term growth into our prospects.
I totally agree about thinking that changing the time horizon about which we look at things and determine success helps us on an individual level quite a lot. We're more resilient when we look further out. We're more likely to learn, more likely to adapt, more likely to build strong relationships. The motto that live today like it's your last is the most terrible bit of advice in the world. If you did that, you'd hate tomorrow when it turned up. It's all about thinking slightly further out, and therefore we're willing to make sacrifices now for gains further down the road or for the next generation or whatever else it happens to be. So I totally agree with Emma and Ian on the thinking of the long term, making investment bets. I think one of those areas where it comes very strongly is in this tension on energy. On the one hand, we desperately worry about our environment and the planet and the need to avoid destroying our own planet. On the other hand, we need energy security. And we need to make sure that we can still afford to have the power to send all those emails we're sending to each other and all the other things that we're doing. And so I think the idea of building for the long term is exactly right, and that will mean investing potentially in nuclear. It will mean definitely investing in sustainable, but that will take time to get there. And it might mean short-term decisions like Rosebank, where we have to be able to make sure that we've got the energy security, because if we don't have the security, we haven't got the long term down the road.
What Rosebank is to those people?
The North Sea field that the government this week gave permission, a license to drill, mainly for oil, but partly for gas. And interestingly enough, the opposition has said they're not going to withdraw the license,
right.
but they wouldn't issue any new ones, which is not entirely clear where they're heading on that one.
Do you think we've become more short-termist?
I think that my meta view on this is actually we kind of know what the answers are. The people know what the answers are, and there are the people with the political leadership to make them happen. But unfortunately, the two don't overlap, which is a problem. So you have these very strong political leaders. You could argue Boris Johnson, you could argue Donald Trump, who have this enormous pulling power, but haven't got the ideas or the vision to make them happen. And you've got others, we can name them, I'm sure, who know largely what the right things to do are, which is digitisation and mindset and all the other things that we talked about in this panel. Nothing we've said is going to be a complete shock to those who thought about these issues, but who haven't got the political leadership to make it happen. Driverless trains is an obvious example. Driverless trains, Doctors' Light Railway has been driverless. We've got driverless trains in Paris and Tokyo and Dubai, all over the world. But nonetheless, most of our trains are not driverless here because we haven't had the political leadership to be able to make that sort of change. But it would improve efficiency and it wouldn't have no negative impact on safety, possibly improve it. So the range of
slightly negative impact on jobs.
But that's the point, is that but all these changes, if we digitise the NHS, which is clearly the right thing to do. In Northern Ireland, they've got a brilliant experiment, the first one in the world, where integrating social care and primary care trusts and the hospitals and so forth, bring it all together as a single data pool. You have one medical record, you'll have collective data so you can work out where illnesses are, how to predict them, all of the things. But that's going to change jobs.
It changes them. We will lose jobs, but we'll make new ones as well.
Exactly.
But I think all of this, everything you're all talking about, requires an openness to more change at a time when, as you said, people are feeling very uncertain. Yeah. And that's the challenge. And I always think governments can never go that far ahead of public opinion. So people always blame government, but the truth is, in a democracy, a government actually can't go that. It has to take people with it. Yeah. And I think a lot of this is very difficult. I mean, just to bring it home a bit, I mean, it's still true, and I think we're one of the only countries in the world where if you are taken unconscious in an ambulance to A&E, most hospitals will not be able to see your medical record. I mean, that's insane, right? And we've all been in hospital where they come around, you're with your dad and he can barely speak, and they're like, what drugs are you taking? And you go home and look in his cupboard, and you're thinking, that is insane.
It really is.
That is the result of years and years of resistance by the British Medical Association, basically, to joining up data. But again, there are very good reasons to worry about the privacy of data.
I was going to say that's the issue.
That's that particular debate, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, our health is an economic issue. It's also a very intensely personal and private issue.
Absolutely.
And I personally think it's essential that we have good governance around data privacy.
Absolutely.
And very serious. We're one of the world's leading suppliers of HIV drugs, and I can tell you in that sector, which everybody can imagine, even if thankfully we've made huge leaps forward in innovation, the stigma involved in it is very, very serious. And the whole space around pre-existing conditions and what you've seen in some parts of the world in terms of consequences that people can have if there is undue disclosure. But we do big partnerships with 23andMe. We see the possibilities of genetic data now being able to, frankly, get far more predictive for all of us on how to manage our health more effectively. If you ask people if they are happy to have their data shared and disclosed that may result in innovation for them or for their children, by the way, when it's a genetic issue, they almost always say yes.
Right.
So actually we do need responsible controls, but when we've got them, and actually the example you use is one of the most spectacular ones, people have said yes, but we don't get out of our own way to actually hand the data over. And really basic things like being able to read across from one appointment to the next, even before you get to the opportunity of innovation, or the basic efficiencies in the NHS where doctors are spending all their time filling in admin forms. Our country needs to invest in technology, and the NHS is one of the places we should do it first, because the benefits of then being able to look after the health of our workforce, quite aside from the basic humanity of it, is absolutely essential, and it should be a first place for investment for the government.
Well, I totally agree with you about health and investment in technology, but there are other services we can do it in parallel. I mean, the police force, for example, is a massive opportunity for reform culture in terms of mindset, as we've learned about in recent weeks. But there's brilliant new technology that on CCTV cameras, you can get in a second, instantly do face recognition and know if that's someone on the register that you're looking for. It's been used now. And
it's used in China. And we all
it's used in Britain. It's used in the Metropolitan Police.
Yes.
Right.
Oh, really?
And it's kept for a nanosecond. And it's enough nanosecond, and it's enough time to check if you're on the criminals they're seeking out. And this has an amazing ability to reduce crime.
What happens if you're a protester who doesn't happen to like some government policies, and you've been standing on the corner of Parliament Square for weeks, and they
if you're not on the register, you've not been sought out for a criminal offence, then for absolutely sure.
I love this. We've been violently agreeing with each other all panel, and now we're having an argument. So about time.
I have to say, I think you've touched on an area which I think is really interesting and really controversial. I think that the level of surveillance that China is now using through exactly the kind of technologies you've talked about makes it really, really clear to me where that could go. And the fact that we have just seen legislation go through Parliament, which essentially means that if you are a protester, particularly an environmental protester who a Home Secretary decides they don't like, you actually can fall foul of the police very, very quickly, and you can be prevented from going to any future demonstrations. So I am really nervous about that. Because on the one hand, yes, I can see exactly the point, it's efficient. And of course, they always tell you, right, we've had this fear, they always tell you, oh, it's fine because we're going to be very limited in our use of it, and we're only going to keep it for a nanosecond, and then we're going to get rid of it. And then then they build a database, and there's a database, and they go, oh, well, actually, we did, in fact, keep it a bit longer than we said. Yeah, so I think that one's a bit concerning myself. I mean, you guys are all for technology. I'm all for technology, but I think that's exactly the kind of... We have to protect against
our rights. We have to make sure... But if we're doing a lot of this already. I mean, if you go down that route, then you wouldn't have single medical records, which you've just been advocating.
You don't need facial recognition for single medical records.
No, but you still have data about people and biometric data and all sorts of information.
I think facial recognition
so the facial's the for you is the bit where it crosses.
As you've just discovered, is a bit of a
bit triggering.
But that's exactly the debate.
How many people here would be worried to think that their CCTV cameras can recognise your face and match it to a criminal database? Anyone worried? No. Oh, lots of people. And who's not worried? Oh, not worried. Okay, well, all right. You were...
That's that sold.
That's because you're all assuming that you're not going to be on the criminal database.
Except for those who put their hands up and will be chasing you afterwards.
Yes, we've already taken pictures of you. Right, I'm going to ask questions. I'll get you to ask a question in a minute, but let me just ask one more thing for everybody. Because you've all had really, really interesting careers. And you all employ a lot of people. And so I wanted to ask you, what would you advise, I'm going to start with you, Ian, what would you advise young people today to do? You know, if they want an interesting career in life, you know, should they go and do a degree in AI? Should they do humanities? Should they do an apprentice? You know, what would you advise someone who's 18 to do?
The givens, obviously, are technology. I think that culturally we've got a lot to offer in this country. And whatever happens with technology, we need content, we need skills, and that skills may be in sectors which are not easily replicable with technology. So we talk about, in my business, hospitality, we talk about the arts, we talk about content in general. I think those are all strong positives.
And what do you mean by content?
I mean media, making stuff,
right.
You know, whether it's photography, whether it's video, TV, plays, culture. Everyone's going to have more leisure time. So as that changes, we have to embrace technological change, which may mean, at least in the short term, there are people that have more leisure time as technology takes over, and there are perhaps less jobs in the short term. So we need great content. I think this country's good at that. So content, hospitality, tourism, technology, medicine, healthcare, these are all great sectors, and I think that those are sustainable careers.
And do you think everybody needs maths A-level?
Not A-level, no, but I do think that
Because you like the idea of the baccalaureate, you said earlier.
I do, but my part...
This is a question close to my heart. I have 3 children. So.
My real big win in that is not necessarily being able to perform quadratic equations, but it's more about having financial awareness. The difference between what's a mortgage, what's a bond, what's a stock. People come out of school with not the faintest idea about overdrafts, about how to manage money, what's a mortgage, what can I afford, what's tax, what's long-term, short-term, death duties, whatever it might be. We're absolutely got clueless generations who fritter away money, put money on credit cards, don't understand the issues between long and short-term debt.
Yeah.
And so if we get something right on that, even at GCSE level, forget A-levels for the moment.
I do think this practical living, whether it be, frankly, basic financial awareness or the things that Octavius was talking about on how to lead others, being more human in an age of technology, whether you're in the caring institutions or, frankly, just motivating people at work to do more than they ever thought they could. Giving them the extra few minutes that inspires them and gives them security in an ever-changing world. All of those things, I think, are really important in what is in the content of our education system. Going back to the core of your question of what do you advise people, I'm laughing to myself because my 4 young adult children take absolutely no advice from me whatsoever on these topics. But I think my main advice would be don't worry so much about strategizing a career because it will work out in the end. There's absolutely no substitute for hard work. And therefore, choose something you really enjoy, because if you enjoy it, you'll be good at it. And if you care about it, it'll get you through the difficult days, and it won't feel like work, and you won't talk about work-life balance because work is part of life.
Yes. Yes.
Keep learning. Really, and that means building your tech capability, but also more human capability. And most of all, I would say, be careful about the company you keep, because work is a human endeavour, and you want colleagues that teach you, support you, you learn from. So pick culture carefully.
Yeah.
And in the company you keep, my other top, not very feminist advice is marry well. I mean that if you want a career. That's it.
Yeah. I was just one last question to you. I mean, you are running one of the world's biggest life sciences companies, but you're actually a humanities graduate, aren't you?
Yeah, which is, and I'm a huge believer in the breadth of education, and that doesn't have to be academic education. It's discovering, I've lived in 3 continents, I've been incredibly lucky, and I did my degree in Latin, which is utterly useless. But just quod spiro spero, as long as I'm breathing, I'm still hoping, and we need to keep learning. So.
Excellent. Octavius?
I completely agree with Ian and Em, and particularly this idea of finding out where your passion is and following it, and being the sense of what do you want to do in life, what legacy do you want to have, what impact do you want to have, and if you find out what that is, that acts as your North Star and your motivation. Now, clearly you definitely need to work hard. There's no substitute for conscientiousness, and there's also no substitute for appetite for learning. And that desire constantly to be curious, to learn new things, to recognize you'll have many careers and they'll take many forms, and that will be a beautiful and wonderful thing. But Plato originally said the good life is the life you lead in accordance with your values. And that strikes me as quite good advice that has lasted several thousand years, and I'd probably stick with that as well.
And Emma can translate that into Latin. Does anybody want to ask a question? Gentleman here? Do we have mics or... right, gentleman on the end here.
I can project one.
Oh, lovely, yeah. Thanks.
So, thank you for those wise words, and it's really refreshing to see someone who's in the pharmaceutical industry talk about prevention rather than cure.
Yeah.
But how can you apply that to the governance and to basically to our governments? Because
We're trying.
I know, despite the positivity, I think a lot of people feel that the recent governments have been sort of reactive and sort of firefighting rather than planning for the future. But how can you take the same approach you've talked about in terms of prevention, in terms of, apply that in the way our country is being governed?
Well, I'm not an economist, but I'm not a politician either, and I'm sure it's an extremely difficult job, and I think we should get Camilla to answer on this as well, since she's involved in politics.
Are you talking more broadly about
on healthcare
government as a whole, aren't you?
No,
Or just health?
Sort of taking that approach of prevention rather than sort of being reactive.
What
you have to plan for the future.
What I would say is, in a democracy, we're always living towards the next election, which puts a timeline on things. But where I am optimistic, and I've been lucky enough, not because I've been around for a long time, but to advise 3 British Prime Ministers on business, and I think there is across all parties a deep belief that both life sciences matters in this country and health is recognised as being core for the economy. The challenge is we only spend 3% of our healthcare budget on prevention. But there is an incredible alignment, cross-party alignment actually, on what matters here, investing in innovation, being competitive on clinical trials, addressing the challenges in the NHS. The problem is making a regulator that's capable and organised. The problem is an execution gap. What I'd love to see is not necessarily spending more, by the way, but what we allocate our capital to within the NHS budget being massively more efficient. I can't tell you because we're not completely off the record, but there are ongoing discussions, including for the upcoming statement around this. I just love to see us pushing on the enabling factor of technology. But, we need to keep having the conversation. I'd like the media to be more vocal on this. You actually wrote on it quite recently, but I think we need the help of the commentators as well to keep prioritising this piece, because it is in everybody's interest. It is literally better for the economy, for burdened healthcare systems, for innovation and for individuals. There's no downside here.
Very good. Okay, I can see a lot of hands up, so I'm going to take 3 questions together. So gentleman in the middle, lady there, lady there. Can we get mics and then would you like to start? And then we'll take them all together and then we'll spread them out through the panel. That's it.
Well, great. Thanks, Camilla. Great way to The elephant in the room at the moment is the environment, of course, and you haven't really touched on that. I'd just be interested to hear from the private sector's perspective, particularly Ian with his real estate portfolio, hospitality, and then with Emma as well, in terms of how you're taking the lead here before government regulates.
Very good. Right. Is it? Yeah, lovely.
Hi. I wanted to ask Emma about the idea of taxation in terms of incenting people to eat the right things, because you talk about prevention. And I don't understand why you can't tax sugar and subsidise.
Well, we did. I'm the author of the sugar tax. We did that. We did that one. But yeah, that's a great question.
Subsidise fruit and vegetable. And
yeah. Very interesting. And lady here.
Ian Livingstone made the point about going to university and the need for it. How many of the panel went to Oxford or Cambridge?
Very good question. I was actually thinking of asking that myself, but then I thought maybe I'd better not. Right, so let's open this up. Who wants to answer what question? Ian, would you like to, which question would you like? Actually, no, let's say how many of the panel went to Oxford or Cambridge? Put your hand up.
Not me.
Right. There you are. Answered that one. Ian, what would you like to take? Which question would you like to take?
Specifically on sustainability,
yeah.
Clearly it's something that's a responsibility for all of us in our businesses to think about and look at best practice. And we're retrofitting where we can. We are saving energy where we can. And certainly in terms of new builds, we're building buildings that are more sustainable. Some of the government deadlines, in particular for big office buildings, are not necessarily achievable. So I think we'll see a lot of surplus office stock that comes out of the availability pool. In terms, it's clearly important for our guests in hotels. It's clearly important for our staff, and it's important for the environment. So yes, we're retrofitting. We're doing what we can. We're even incentivizing people to change small things like changing towels less. And I had a really interesting conversation this morning with somebody about putting more hooks up in bathrooms to save towels and save weight. And it's small, lots and lots of small things like that. It's highly important, and we'd probably like to see more incentives to do it, because retrofitting isn't cheap, and there isn't much incentive to do it, but we need to do it.
Thank you. Octavius, what would you like to respond to?
I've got a tip on how to get people to reuse their towels more, Ian, if you're interested in this.
Tell me more.
This is an experiment done by a professor called Robert Cialdini, and he ran this experiment in hotel rooms, where he said, put a sign saying, please reuse your towel if you're staying more than one night, and 40% did. And then it had a sign that said 80% of people who stay in this hotel reuse their towel, and then it went up to 60%. And then the sign said 80% of people who've been and stayed in this room reuse their towel, and then that went up again further. And it's an extraordinary thing. The one thing you don't know, you never know the person who previously was in your hotel room, and you owe them nothing at all. Right. But the mere fact that they'd done it made you more likely to do it. So there's some psychological techniques.
Post-COVID, when we couldn't find any people to clean rooms and we had terrible staff shortages, we experimented in the budget hotels with saying, if you're staying 2 nights, would you rather we clean the room the first night, or would you rather a £5 voucher to spend in the bar? And 90% of them took the bar voucher. And by the way, it saved us money too.
I just wonder whether you could extend that to a whole lot of other things.
Yeah.
I mean, home insulation,
I'm not sure
food tax. I mean, interesting.
That one, but
One night, come on, one night in a budget hotel, I think you're all right. But
Emma, did you want to come back to something?
no, I just wanted to comment on the environmental agenda, because it's right that we haven't really covered it, and I'm very much in agreement with Ian on this. I mean, if you just step back and take a long-term view of our responsibilities as big companies, we have to be part of the solution here. And for our kids and our kids' the science is extraordinarily clear, and you just have to look about what's going on in the world to recognise that we're hurtling in the wrong direction. As a listed company, we have both obligations to and have with enthusiasm made very public commitments which are audited, and so it's an actual, serious fiscal responsibility around getting to net zero and being nature positive. Just to be clear, back to our early conversation, the healthcare sector is 5% of the global carbon problem, but the vast majority of that is hospitalisation and travelling to hospital. So keeping people out of treatment and preventing it and keeping them at home. It's not only the burden of producing drugs. And in GSK, I can tell you, for those of you that follow this, by far our biggest contribution to that challenge, and we're not a huge contributor, but it is in what's called scope 3, so the utilisation of our drugs, and particularly our inhalers. And there's one inhaler called Ventolin. It's 40% of my global carbon contribution, but it is sold mainly in emerging markets to people who are frightened of dying if they have an asthma attack and don't use this medicine. So you get in an ethical debate about how do you innovate with a propellant that can be sold super cheaply so more people can be kept well and you're not taking needed drugs away from them, but where you are being good for the environment. Great news is, off the record, but I'm reviewing at a board meeting very shortly, can we get to a new innovation propellant that will allow us in a few years' time, it will completely transform the carbon contribution of what we do. So I'm really excited about this and I care about it. And by the way, most interestingly, so do our people. We employ over 80,000 people and we have many, many partners. The next generation care about being part of a company in healthcare that isn't just supporting the access to drugs agenda, but is doing it in a sustainable, responsible way. So I don't think there's any choice here. Of course, we need the government to give us I have a lot of understanding for trying to be practical about doing the short term and the long term at the same time. Yep. It's not easy, but we can't walk away from this.
Okay. I'm going to say something about health taxes, but does anyone? I'm going to take one more question. Lady there, so just hold on to the mic and I'll just talk a bit about health tax. So when I worked in Number 10, I was the author of the sugar tax on fizzy drinks. And we thought that would be the beginning of a whole series of measures against obesity. Now, it wasn't for a number of reasons. I think mainly because a lot of people, particularly in the Conservative Party, find it very difficult to tell people what to do, how to live their lives. And it was misunderstood because what we tried to do, and we did it very successfully with drinks, we put a tax with a 2-year delay on companies to get them to reformulate. So our objective was not to raise money, it was to get the companies to take the sugars out of the drinks. Now, most companies did. So in fact, that policy resulted in a 35% reduction in the amount of sugar that all of us now drink. Oh, and most people haven't noticed that. Coca-Cola wouldn't change it because it's got a particular formula and they pay the tax. But basically, it's actually quite an example of companies which came together, thought, okay, we're going to have to do this. And the rest of the world looked at that and thought, well, we might have to do this. Your question is about how can you extend that or should you extend that? I think we probably should. Yeah. Because for me, one of the things I've looked at for many years is we're all told all the time about what we should eat and what we should do. We're presented with a whole lot of junk, and actually it's human.
Addictive.
It's addictive, and sugar is addictive, and the combination of sugar and fat is addictive. And we've been presented for years with these low-fat foods, which turn out to be full of sugar and carbs. So I think there actually is there's more of a public willingness to do that. And if you talk to people in the industry, they kind of know it's coming. I think the question is to get a government to be sort of brave enough to actually do it.
And we have to simultaneously make healthier foods cheaper.
Well, sorry, that was your other point, yeah, which I think is quite tricky. Last question from the lady over there.
Hello, I was just wondering on a global sense of this recession versus resurrection, whether there's any thought about rebuilding economic models so that they're not predicated on continual expansion and increasing consumption. Recession is defined as an absence of growth, so just kind of going along as you are is considered recessive. So I'm just wondering, going forward, whether you foresee any chance of rebuilding our economic models in perhaps a different way.
Very profound question. Anyone want to take it?
I'd say you.
Yeah, okay. I think it's a brilliant question. I mean, yes, you're right. I mean, I think a recession is defined as 2 quarters of negative GDP, isn't it? And clearly our entire model is built around GDP, and we all know that GDP is has strange quirks in it. So if you go to war and kill a lot of people, your GDP goes up. David Cameron, who I used to work for, actually did think very deeply for a long time about trying to create something slightly different, called it a Wellbeing index, got completely monstered for it, and it sort of went away again because it all sounded a bit jokey. I think from an environmental point of view, you're right, that's where the debate is going. What do we really mean by growth? And as you say, is it all based on consumption? And are we consuming the wrong things? The challenge is it's the model we've got, and it's the model that has brought a lot of people out of poverty all over the world. But I do think, so I don't know the answer, but I think it's a really, really important question to have posed. And I'm sorry that we've been too shallow to get to it. But thank you all for your great questions, and thank you all to my amazing panel. And give a round of applause.